So first, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. We know it's been challenging times for the past couple of weeks. I'm actually here in Boston, and this morning we just received a, no going outside of your home order for the next 2 weeks. So rapidly digesting that and figuring out what we need to do here. But in any case, hopefully some of the information we'll provide you this morning will give you food for thought over the next couple of weeks as we all think through our next steps in the offshore wind industry during these somewhat challenging times. First, just a few notes for how we're going to proceed this morning. As I think I mentioned at the start of the conversation, we expect to have over 150 people participating this morning, so thank you all for joining us. We are recording this session, and we'll make the recording as well as the deck available to registered participants sometime later this week. Given the number of folks that have joined us this morning, we won't take live questions, but at the end of the presentation, I'll supply you all with an email, and you're welcome to submit questions and comments to myself. It will be my email that's being shared, and we will endeavor to the extent that some of the questions may be helpful for all of our audience to hear. We'll share the questions and the responses with everyone anonymously. Our agenda this morning is to chat a little bit about what the Manufacturing Services and Supply Chain Group is, who the consortium is, as well as the Business for Offshore Wind Network, and then our supply chain initiatives from the state perspective. So I'll be speaking first just for a few minutes, and then I'll be followed by Liz Burdock. And then we have 4 states participating with us this morning. I greatly appreciate their time, given really what's going on in the news every minute. And we'll hear from each of them in turn. And then I'll close our session this morning at noon with some questions for you all and some proposed next steps. So what are we trying to achieve here? And as you saw on the agenda, I'm going to start with talking about the MSFC, which is the acronym I'm trying to use, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the consortium, and Liz will speak to the network's role and what the network is doing, as well as how we're attempting to coordinate and bring all of you together with us. So our goals with the MSSC are really to connect several different populations across the offshore wind sector, smaller innovators, state networks, applicable suppliers that are already working in maybe offshore wind industry, but not in, in offshore wind industry, bringing new folks from offshore wind to more traditional or past industries, so things like offshore drilling and things like that, and connecting them with the offshore wind industry, as well as offshore wind developers and innovators that we know that are working in this space that may have been around longer, but are now as well connected to the research and development community, as well as to maybe some larger innovators who are more well-established. And trying to connect those with some of the larger corporate companies, as I mentioned, the state networks from a regional perspective. So we know, and we'll hear from a number of states later this morning, but trying to connect those a little bit better in the networks that they've established, industry as a whole, and then the research institutions that I mentioned. So while these lines are kind of going in both directions, you could see them also connecting diagonally and with each of these kind of groups connecting with each other and working from our individual perspectives and trying to bring them all together in a loose network where we're sharing innovation, research, development, and supply chain. So this is the collaboration that the consortium is thinking about with the network. Again, bringing together our state supply chain networks that already exist or are starting to exist more broadly across the country. The companies that we're all working in this space, whether they be developers, investors, part of the supply chain that are making different component parts, or other aspects that will be contributing to offshore wind development. The consortium members, which consist of the development community, research community, states, a number of different states, and our research advisory group, which I'll talk about in just a minute, which represents more the academic and research focus group, or excuse me, advisory group. And Liz will speak to more about the offshore wind network. So to step back just a little bit, I first wanted to talk about the supply chain group that we're creating and trying to create this network. But what really is the consortium, and what have we been doing, and why are we focused on bringing the supply chain together? So the consortium was created around 2 years ago now with a focus on, we're a not-for-profit entity, and we're focused on collaborating industry and prioritizing R&D activities to reduce LCOE of offshore wind in the US. And then, of course, to maximize other economic and social benefits. The desired impacts from DOE and our other funders, who I'll speak about in a moment, are to create innovations that are responsive to technical and supply chain barriers faced by offshore wind projects in the US and developers, build strong networks connecting technology innovators, investors, and industry, and increase US content and job opportunities across the country. We were originally administered by NYSERDA, and NYSERDA is greatly involved and supportive of the consortium. Over the past 6 months, we are moving, and in the next 6 months, we'll be moving to transfer the administrative aspects of the consortium over to consortium staff, now that it is a standalone entity of 501c3, which I'm the executive director of. We've done much of that transfer in the past few months, but have a few more steps to take over the course of 2020. The value of our existing funding is $41 million, with contributions from DOE, NYSERDA, states, who you're going to hear from today, and member contributions. The current duration of the funding that we have is 4 years, and the goal of the consortium is ultimately be self-sustaining, collect additional and distribute additional research funds through a number of different solicitations that are targeted to the offshore wind industry. And I'll talk about that solicitation in just a minute, or those solicitations in just a minute. In addition, I do want to mention we are collaborating with Innovate UK. Innovate UK launched a solicitation late last year and is in progress right now, which is focused on connecting both UK innovators and supply chain with US companies. Right now, I believe they're in phase 1 of their program, in which they've selected just over a dozen of entities for a grant award, and those grant awardees are looking for US partners. And you can learn more about that from connecting to the consortium website or from myself, and also at Innovate UK's website. So I mentioned that to date, the consortium was working on allocating research and development funds that were received by our original funders. The manner in which we've done that was first via NYSERDA issued issued a solicitation last summer. That solicitation closed in December of this past year in 2019. To date, 8 awards have been made, publicly announced. We are in the process of reviewing many additional proposals and are endeavoring to make additional award announcements through that solicitation by May of this year. I'll speak at the end of our conversation this morning. I'll speak to a little bit about what happens next with additional solicitations. But we're very happy that we've already made 8 awards and are looking to announce additional ones, as I said, in May. So please pay attention to the consortium website and additional announcements we'll make. And part of the reason why we wanted to bring a little bit closer together some of the networks that are out there for supply chain is to connect some of the potential proposers for future solicitations with innovators, research institutions, and developers, so that you can collectively think about some good proposals to submit in that solicitation, which will be forthcoming. And then finally, just from the consortium perspective this morning, I did mention our research and development advisory group. This advisory group is one of our 4 advisory groups that we have at the consortium. This advisory group is focused on research and academic institutions which are involved in offshore wind. Of course, there are entities that are involved in offshore wind that are not part of our advisory group, but we welcome them to join. And this group helps us form our roadmap, which in turn informs what our solicitations look like in the research that we fund. We're funding now and will fund in the future. We're also hoping to tap our research and development advisory group and connect them with some of the networks that we mentioned earlier and that you're going to hear about later this morning to better connect the development, innovation, what's happening in the private sector with what might be happening as well at universities and other research institutions across the US. And now I'm going to ask Liz, if you're there, Liz Burdock, to join us. Okay. Liz, can you hear us? And are you? Excellent. Okay, I'll let you go ahead and get started, and I will advance the slides for you unless, unless you can do it yourself. I'm not sure if you have a tab down at the bottom.
I'm not sure. We'll try.
Okay, let me know and I'll take care of it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate you including us and being here with all of you this morning. My name is Liz Burdock, as Carrie mentioned, and I have the privilege to lead the business network for offshore wind. For those of you who aren't familiar with who we are, Carrie, you're gonna have to advance it. I can't advance it. For those of you who are not familiar with the business network, we are a 501c3 organization. We're solely focused on offshore wind. That's our one singular focus within all of our work, and we are dedicated to building a U.S. offshore wind supply chain by empowering local companies with education, tools, and connections necessary to participate in both the global and the U.S. offshore wind market. Since our creation in 2012, we've been able to connect more than 6,000 individuals that represent more than 1,500 companies. And we do that through a variety of ways. One is obviously our networking events, which many of you might be familiar with our major event, which is the IPF. We're also a membership-based organization with more than 362 members involved in the network. I want to say, though, that while we get a lot of recognition around the IPF, we're actually a lot more than that singular event. We undertake a variety of activities to help build the market and to follow it and to report on it. One of the things that we do is we manage the Offshore Wind Hub, which is a historical depository of all of the history of the offshore wind industry. We also track public policy and commercial activity. We maintain that data through our offshore wind dashboard, which involves reviewing public information and then personally reaching out to our wide range of contacts and many of our members. We've also developed and maintained the supply chain database. This is an offshore wind specific database with over 1,500 companies signed up and 528 products and services. We power New Jersey's supply chain database, Maryland's, and Virginia. And Carrie, if you can go to the next slide. This is what the national offshore wind supply chain is looking like. Companies have self-identified where they fit into the supply chain, and we're starting to map it out. Can you go to the next slide, Carrie? So this represents what we believe is the offshore wind supply chain and where many of our members fall and our contacts fall. We think we're uniquely qualified to be the supply chain organization and to work with MSCC because of our 8 years of experience working with developers, global tier 1 suppliers, and local companies, which fall in these pieces, 4 pieces of the offshore wind sector. We also have a solid understanding of the education gaps and the needs that all parties have in building out the supply chain through our numerous conversations, focus groups, meetings, and our data collection. And through that, we have been able to gain market and technical expertise on offshore wind supply chain development. Can you go to the next slide, Carrie? So we're really proud to work with Carrie and her team to help connect and inform this supply chain and really inform the national research and development agenda. The business network uses its membership to form working groups, and you can see the 6 working groups that we've established. Working group members that are composed of developers, front-end engineering design consultants, tier 1 component providers, vessel designers, manufacturers, owners and operators, and specialized service providers, including certification, legal, finance, and insurance. Through our daily work with the working group in developing white papers and looking at policy, lessons learned, and experiences, we are able to identify research studies and projects that are needed to help advance the offshore wind industry. And our hope is through the work of our working groups and working with the MSCC that these needs will bubble up to become joint industry projects. Can you go to the next slide, Carrie? Excuse me. So the US has 15 projects under development representing almost a little over 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So during these next few years, because the construction of these projects is going to start in the next 2 to 3 years, and we're going to have a very robust construction period starting in 22, 23. We really hope that we can gather the experiences and the lessons from this development of these projects to inform the R&D and innovation that is required as we move into the 10 gigawatts and beyond, specifically around areas such as grid and transmission, lowering cost of offshore wind, and many of the pillars that have already been described under the DOE Consortium. Can you go to the last slide, Carrie? So just in conclusion, I think it's really important to note that we don't view the US market in isolation, that we're part of a much larger global offshore wind community, and that is essentially going to explode over the next 30 years. So we, as the US, really want to be part of that, and the work that we can all do together to inform the global market will really help create those pathways to this market for those local businesses and states that are looking to enter into the offshore wind industry. And with that, again, I really want to say thank you. We are looking forward to being a strong partner in this endeavor, and are excited to work with you all. And with that, Carrie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Liz. I really appreciate it. And Jennifer, if you are ready, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is well and staying safe in these interesting times. Here in Virginia, well, it's actually about 50 degrees and raining, which is not really very normal for almost April, but there you are. So, you know, we are very, very excited around offshore wind here in Virginia. It's been an exciting legislative season for us. Our 2 big wins this year from a legislative standpoint, besides of course, earlier in the year, the governor's announcement about going to 100% electrical generation in what will now be 2045, and our 5.6 gigawatts of offshore wind in legislation. The 2 big announcements that we got through the legislature this year were, one was $40 million for port infrastructure for Portsmouth Marine Terminal. So that's a fantastic opportunity for us. And then second, the one that we're really proud of is that we will be standing up a division of offshore wind, which will be part of the, it will be a division of the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And I should introduce myself and say that I'm Jennifer Paulus, and I am Chief Deputy for the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy for the state of Virginia, and I'm overseeing the development of offshore wind. So it's been an exciting, 9 months, and certainly one of our major focuses has been the supply chain. In Virginia, we've got some really wonderful natural advantages. We are home to the largest naval base in the world, Naval Station Norfolk. And so as a result, by statute, we are not allowed to have any bridges, because you've always got to be able to get an aircraft carrier out to sea. And so everything that we have is our bridge tunnels. We've got a 55-foot depth ice-free channel all year round, with no overhead draft, 4th largest port in the United States, and plenty of laydown space. So from a natural resources standpoint, for supply chain, we've got lots of opportunities. People ask me, what do we do really, really well in southeastern Virginia? And what I tell them is large-scale maritime steel. It doesn't matter whether we've been building an aircraft carrier or building a wind turbine or building a submarine. It's 90% of it's all the same skill set. So, we've been building ships for 300 years, and it's one of the things that we spend a lot of time, and we have an amazing world-class workforce that goes along with it. And while we're looking at these various, opportunities and looking at, how do we partner on things, and how do we look to bring, companies here, or partner with our friends in, North Carolina and Maryland on doing South Carolina on doing projects. Our economic development partnership is working, very closely with tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers to really try to, really sit down and match their needs. Our attitude very much is, if they can come to Virginia, great. But really, as long as they come to the United States, we all win. As long as we're putting people to work, we all win. And so, I think that in a lot of ways is something that we all need to keep in mind, is that, if we bring these companies here to the United States, we're all going to win. So it's an exciting time to be in wind in Virginia, and we are looking forward to actually putting steel in the water in May. Our CVAL project goes online this summer, and those are, for those of you who might not know, those are 2 test turbines, 8-megawatt turbines that are going to be going into the first 2 turbines into federal waters. So this is actually a research lease. So this is an opportunity for colleges and universities and people to actually look at, try to test out new opportunities, but actually test them out at sea. And so we're really looking forward to that. So they will start generating electricity probably as soon as July. They'll be 26 nautical miles off the coast of Virginia because of our heavy sea lanes between the Navy and the port. But we are very, very excited with that, and looking forward to having our first 2.6 megawatts deployed by 2026. And we're open for business. So if anybody's interested in partnering up, do let me know. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. And Kirsten Hollen, if you're on the line, I'm going to unmute you and let you introduce yourself.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So good morning. Thank you, Carrie and Liz, for hosting this webinar. We're really excited to be a part of it. My name is Kirsten Hollen. I am the program manager for the offshore wind team at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And we, similarly to Virginia and all of our other sort of neighboring states up and down the East Coast, have been working really hard at this sort of sector development for offshore wind for quite a while now. For anybody who may not be familiar, MassCEC is a quasi-governmental entity in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. that works to help the state meet its climate, clean energy, and economic development goals. And the offshore wind team in particular supports the responsible development of offshore wind in the Commonwealth. And to date, Massachusetts has procured 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind through 2 projects, the first being the Vineyard Wind Project, and the second, more recently procured, the Mayflower Wind Project. And the state has committed to procuring an additional 1,600 megawatts through procurements likely in 2022, 2024, and 2026. Massachusetts has a really strong sort of local ecosystem of companies that are well positioned to support this industry. And part of Mass CEC's work is really helping these companies learn more about offshore wind. We support their efforts to become part of this new and growing supply chain and sort of link them up with the industry. And we also help them network directly with developers and buyers in the industry to make sure that we're making those connections and really getting them involved where they can fit in. So I wanted to just start a little bit by talking about sort of the background of our approach to sector development at Mass CEC, and then just go into some of our ongoing initiatives. The state has a long history of supporting offshore wind here in the US, dating back to the early 2000s and the start of the Cape Wind Project. And that support has sort of continued to grow as new lease areas have been identified in federal waters off the south coast of Massachusetts. This early interaction with the industry really paved the way for the state to support a great deal of sort of pre-market planning and analysis initiatives. And very specifically, you know, we talk about ports as being so central and integral to this industry. And one of the specific early state level investments that Massachusetts made was the development of the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal, which is owned and operated by Mass CEC. It can accommodate the heavy lift requirements of the industry, and it remains to this day still the only purpose-built port for offshore wind in the US. And you know, while we recognize that there's going to need to be sort of a network of ports up and down the East Coast to get this industry up and running here in the US, that early investment in the terminal at the state level in Massachusetts really helped sort of get this industry going here in the state from an early stage. In addition to investing in the terminal, Mass CEC's early support included a great deal of sort of early and ongoing data collection work, and we continue to do that. We've got a really strong and powerful ecosystem of universities and research institutions here in Massachusetts that we can draw on. For instance, we've partnered with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to put a LiDAR on their air-sea interaction tower, which is near the lease areas south of Martha's Vineyard. We've also been partnering with folks at the New England Aquarium on wildlife surveys for several years. And the goal of these types of projects is really to put together sort of robust baseline data, long-term baseline data for these wind energy areas. In addition, we've worked to provide some key sort of studies and assessments to help the industry, to help us sort of better understand the industry's needs and how they may be met here in Massachusetts. Back in 2014, Mass CEC commissioned an offshore wind transmission study, which analyzed potential interconnection points and sort of the type of infrastructure that would be needed to interconnect future offshore wind projects to the regional electric grid. We've also done a pretty extensive ports and infrastructure assessment of sites here in Massachusetts, which has analyzed around 18 Massachusetts port facilities so far, to really understand their state of readiness for the offshore wind industry and provide some potential reuse and redevelopment scenarios for those sites to really understand what they would need to do in order to, you know, become either a manufacturing facility or an O&M facility or a staging port for this industry. And then finally, in terms of sort of our pre-market analysis and planning, we worked with UMass Dartmouth, Bristol Community College, and the Massachusetts Maritime Academy to release an offshore wind workforce assessment in 2018 that, again, sort of was really looking at the industry's anticipated workforce needs for 1,600 megawatts of build out for offshore wind. So we've really we've made some significant strides to really understand what the industry needs, and that's been guiding our recent sort of investments and initiatives. And then finally, just in terms of some of our pre-market engagement and sort of initially setting up this industry, we've worked closely with state partners to spearhead extensive stakeholder engagement throughout sort of the federal site identification and selection process, but also beyond. We have periodically convened 2 different working groups focusing respectively on fisheries and marine habitats as they relate to offshore wind. And we regularly meet with a wide variety of offshore wind stakeholders to ensure that the Commonwealth is considering all perspectives and developing this industry responsibly. So we've really taken a pretty comprehensive approach to early market support, analysis, and planning so that we are standing up this new industry, which we see as critical to helping Massachusetts and the US at large achieve its clean energy and GHG reduction targets, but that we're standing it up in a way that is responsible and effective. And so as the industry sort of moves closer to becoming a reality here in the US, getting steel in the ground, steel in the water, Mass CEC's sector development work has supported ongoing supply chain and sector engagement to really help the industry scale and support Massachusetts residents' interests in this industry. We've continued to engage on technical questions like transmission. We recently co-hosted a technical conference on the topic of offshore wind transmission with the Department of Energy Resources. We're continuing to analyze our local workforce and needs and sort of inform, to better inform some grants that we are making regarding workforce investment. We've made grants in terms of workforce training and development, set up the first GWO program here for offshore wind here in the country, here in Massachusetts, and we'll continue to sort of look at what those needs are and make investments accordingly moving forward. And then we also provide sort of a great deal of direct support to companies at all levels of throughout the offshore wind supply chain, and really excited to sort of hear more about this and be a part of this MSSC initiative with the network and the consortium, because this is just sort of building on a lot of the work that Mass CEC is already doing. Through our Massachusetts Offshore Wind Supply Chain Directory, which was the first in the country and sort of has helped spur these networks in other states and sort of more broadly as well. Mass CEC is helping to identify and promote local suppliers for the offshore wind industry. And then through formal events like supply chain forums and meet the buyer events, we continue to foster meaningful business-to-business networking for the industry. And specifically regarding the supply chain directory, we actually recently launched a new and sort of more interactive platform for that. And we really encourage you to go check it out. You can see the link on the slide here. If you haven't already done so, create a listing. And it's a great way to sort of start generating leads and identifying other companies who are interested in working in the Massachusetts offshore wind supply chain. And then finally, I just want to touch a little bit on sort of this idea of regional collaboration. So, you know, at Mass CEC, while our mission is absolutely to help the Commonwealth sort of take advantage of all of the benefits that offshore wind can bring to our residents, we definitely recognize the various elements that impact this industry often transcend state boundaries. And as such, we are consciously working with our neighboring states to identify areas in which we may be able to collaborate to build an efficient and sort of regional ecosystem for offshore wind. Some early areas that we've identified and have begun to collaborate on relate to fisheries and wildlife research. Also sort of this innovation funding through the consortium. It's a really exciting way, I think, to bring states and other key stakeholders together to be working to support this industry in a cohesive and comprehensive way. And we look forward to sort of continuing these conversations and continuing to identify areas for additional future collaboration, potentially through things like the MSSC and other networks. So as this industry continues to evolve and mature, Mass CEC's support will do the same. We are working on helping to make more meaningful and targeted business connections as we move forward, really foster potential partnerships or joint ventures, you know, with really experienced Massachusetts companies and those that may have more experience in offshore wind from Europe. And just really continuing to support companies that are interested in serving the offshore wind industry in Massachusetts and more broadly up and down the East Coast. So with that, I think that concludes my presentation. I'll turn it back over to Carrie, and happy to answer any questions, I think, after the webinar online.
Great. Thanks so much, Kirsten. I appreciate it. So Matt Vestal, if you're ready to go, we'll unmute you and get you started.
Great. Carrie, can you please confirm that you can hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Fantastic. So this is Matt Vestal. I am a senior advisor to the large-scale renewables team at NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And for those not familiar with NYSERDA or the New York State Offshore Wind Program, NYSERDA is a bit of a unique vehicle in that NYSERDA both runs our offshore wind project procurements and also supports ongoing supply chain and market development through some components that I'll mention on today's presentation. And so before I dive into some of the information that's shown on your screen in front of you, I'd like to just highlight that New York State's offshore wind program is part of the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act, which was signed into law by Governor Cuomo last summer. And this calls for the state to develop 9 gigawatts of offshore wind power by the year 2035. And this legislation is comprised of many elements of, that drive clean energy development in the state. But I think most notably, we should call out that 9 gigawatts of offshore wind development is part of a statewide requirement to reach 70% renewable energy generation by the year 2030. So certainly some very bold leadership in the state of New York. And I think this is these are the types of targets and ambitions that are really required on a regional basis in order to drive markets forward. And so I think we're certainly pleased to see that that New York is just one of several states along the east coast of the United States that is moving forward with not only aggressive offshore wind targets, but also bold and meaningful clean energy targets across the board. And so what this slide in front of folks shows is the types of incentives that are currently available and relevant for the offshore wind supply chain. As I mentioned before, NYSERDA is an active participant in the management of these incentive programs, but we also work closely with a couple of other notable state agencies. So some names that the industry should be familiar with are one, Empire State Development, which is abbreviated ESD on this slide. They are the economic development agency in New York State who manage many technology agnostic programs, such as a number of as-of-right incentives, which you'll see on this slide include an investment tax credit for up to 5% for new New York State manufacturers, low-cost power opportunities. They also carry discretionary incentives with refundable tax credits for job creation, milestone-based grant payments. All of this, again, is run by our partners at Empire State Development. But we also work very closely with the New York Green Bank, who you'll find under the finance section of this slide. We should note that they manage over $1 billion to support the deployment of clean energy resources, and they are actually a division of NYSERDA, so we work very closely with them. And their team is certainly quite eager to jump into the offshore wind industry, whether that be on the project side or on the supply chain side through the support of port infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, or miscellaneous work, what have you. But I think sprinkled throughout all of these buckets, we will see that NYSERDA has a fairly consistent influence as well. Most notably, I'd like to call out the investment that the state is going to be making in port infrastructure. NYSERDA is leading that effort, and this is a process that will invest $200 million into New York State port infrastructure specifically to support offshore wind. This is a competitive process of which we've already completed the first phase of at the end of 2019. The phase 2 request for proposals will proceed shortly here in 2020 to get that money out the door and to work quite quickly here. I do think that we should provide the caveat that, I certainly echo the thoughts that Jennifer and Kirsten, my colleagues in Virginia and Massachusetts, have noted this morning as well, in that we are of course all in favor of pushing forward a national industry. And so while every state wants to of course maximize the economic development in its own state, we recognize that market-based solutions are going to be the most efficient path forward. And so we see our job as the state to facilitate those market-based solutions to provide capital where needed and where there is currently a dearth of capital in the market, but not to force market solutions, but instead to work with the market, again, to find solutions that will drive down cost in the long term and bring jobs to local markets. And so maybe the last thing before jumping to the next slide here is just noting that we think it's one thing to provide contracts for offshore wind projects in the long term. It's another to support manufacturing and supply chain work up front. But I think if you do those two things and forget the third element, which is workforce development, then the supply chain will not be sustainable in the long term. And so paying particular attention to the workforce element, we just want to note that ESD does have some generic programs to support new types of workforce training. But as we'll see on the next slide, NYSERDA in New York State broadly have also worked very hard to deliver workforce training solutions for the offshore wind industry that is rapidly approaching on the horizon here. So with that, we can jump to the next slide. And I think this slide is going to show just how various elements of program development need to work together in order to drive a successful market. So a few things that I've noted already include workforce development, our offtake contracts, and our investments in port infrastructure. But there are two other pieces we think that are likewise quite critical. One being the engagement, events, and supply chain database work that NYSERDA runs. So this includes supply chain forums, technical and training workshops, and then a New York specific database similar to the one that was described that's done on the national scale. So I think that there's some benefit to running New York specific events and database in this space, that being primarily those projects, that have contracts through NYSERDA for the long-term sale of their offshore wind renewable energy certificates are required through our contracts to make economic opportunities available to local New York companies. And so through participation in that database, I should say, these companies are putting themselves on the map and making or ensuring that they are advised and kept in the loop of those economic opportunities that are coming through the projects that we have under contract. And so folks are probably quite familiar, but for the avoidance of doubt, New York currently has just north of 1.8 gigawatts of projects under contract. That includes 2 contracts with NYSERDA for the Empire Wind Project and the Sunrise Wind Project. Then we also have a third project, the South Fork Wind Farm, which is under contract through one of our load-serving entities, the Long Island Power Authority, out on Long Island. And so together, again, those represent about 1.8 gigawatts, which are a really good foothold in our pathway towards 9 gigawatts of market development. And then I think the fifth element of this wheel that I haven't spoken about specifically is the business development initiatives. This is again noting that ESD really leads that space for New York State, but we do work very closely with them on a daily basis, again, to engage directly with offshore wind market participants, to not only provide them with financial incentives where appropriate, but also to connect them to local market participants to aid in the development of partnerships, and also to link them up to could be local nonprofits who are work closely with local labor advocates, the EJ community, community colleges, secondary education, what have you. And so this is more than just a program for financial incentive distribution, but it is also, I think more truly an all hands on deck approach to driving market development forward. The green box at the bottom left of this slide notes that New York State is all in on various components of the offshore wind supply chain. I think we have a particular focus on a few elements here, one being O&M, the second being manufacturing, the third being staging and installation, and the fourth being vessel maintenance and construction. This is, we note that each of these elements carry with them different types of financial requirements, different technology requirements, as well as different levels of local economic development. But again, we are working very closely with the industry to determine which of these buckets and in what combination work not only for New York State, but also provide long-term benefits for the broader region. So I think with that, I want to be conscious of time as well. I'll pass off for now, but please do feel free to pass along any questions you have, and look forward to continuing to work with you all to drive this market forward. Thank you. And Carrie, I'll pass it back to you if you're still there. Yep.
Is Michael on the line?
Yeah, I don't know. Carrie, are you on mute or whether you can? I don't know if you're still there. No. Okay. We'll carry on. I won't be able to change the slides just yet, but I think next up was Sam Byrne from Maryland. Are you? I'll just unmute you, Sam. Are you?
Hey,
are you there, Sam?
Yep, I'm here. Can you?
Perfect. Are you okay to speak without the slide? Apologies for that.
Yes, that's actually fine. I do not have slides.
Okay. Well, there you go. Perfect.
So, but it's good to have everyone here to talk about offshore wind this morning. I hope everyone is, staying warm and safe and healthy. It's also. Did the slide just recording just end?
Yeah, it's just the slide's gone, but it's okay.
Fine. Here to talk about offshore wind. I hope everyone's staying healthy and safe in these interesting times. So Maryland is also, sorry, I'm going to back up. It's good to see what all of the other states are doing all up front, side by side, because it looks like a lot of us are doing very similar work in our states to support the offshore wind industry. Maryland has taken a comprehensive approach to offshore wind in supporting the market and pipeline of projects. We are also supporting academic research and business research. And in addition, we are supporting our local ports and the supply chain itself through various state agencies and partners. So Maryland has a current offshore wind goal not to exceed 10% of all electricity sales within the state. Now that roughly translates to about 1,600 megawatts. And that is a goal that will be achieved by 2030. That goal also requires a minimum of 1,200 megawatts by 2020 in round 2 projects. That'll be, for lack of a better word, solicited or through RFPs in January 1st, 2020, 2021, and 2022. So over the next 3 years. Maryland also already has, I'm rounding up here, but about 400 megawatts of offshore wind. The projects were approved in 2017, and those projects are very important because they were some of the first approved by a state government through a competitive process. Those projects are the 120 megawatt Skipjack project and the 248 megawatt U.S. wind project, which I don't think has a formal name. Now, these approvals were also important for Maryland because it does help require some local content. Specifically, the developers are required to make port investments totaling about $40 million collectively. Ørsted, the developer of the Skipjack project, announced that they would be making their share of that investment last July at Trade Point Atlantic, which is a private port just outside Baltimore, Maryland. It's one of the biggest on the East Coast that is available. It's 3,250 acres. In addition, if you're interested in seeing more about it, I encourage you to go onto their website. They have a fantastic virtual tour of the property. Those project approvals also required an additional $76 million investment into steel manufacturing in the state, specifically for offshore wind. That's going to help drive a local supply chain and companies to support that investment. At the Maryland Energy Administration, our offshore wind program really has two key approaches to help support offshore wind, and that's to de-risk offshore wind projects, generally speaking, as well as to help lower the cost of offshore wind projects. Now, the de-risking we're not really going to talk about, but that's largely through supporting environmental and wildlife research, as well as other things of that nature. Now, to help lower the cost of offshore wind projects in Maryland, we are helping. One of the key ways of achieving that is by helping establish a robust, efficient, and competitive offshore wind supply chain in the state. Maryland got started back in 2014 with a partnership with the Business Network for Offshore Wind, which used to be named the Business Network for Maryland Offshore Wind, and doing a lot of that similar work that we are seeing in Massachusetts and New York with helping businesses connect, business-to-business networking and all of that through offshore wind supply chain days, online webinars such as this one, as well as other supplier days directly coordinated with the developers and the OEMs of the turbines. In addition, Maryland is also has been helping to educate the business community that is here already, that these businesses do work or offer goods and services that are applicable to offshore wind. And that's one other aspect of the work that we've been doing. Sorry, I think I just cut out there. At the Maryland Energy Administration, we also have two of the first offshore wind grant programs specifically tailored to help the emerging supply chain in Maryland. And one of those key aspects of it is our workforce training program, which provides training for, or provides grant funding for workforce training centers across the state. In addition, we also have our Maryland Offshore Wind Business CapEx program, where we are helping those businesses that have already identified themselves as being interested in offshore wind to prepare and make the business investments in order to prepare for this industry when it comes to the state. And one other thing that we've also been doing to support the industry over a number of years is, like I mentioned before, a lot of the research for environment and wildlife, but also last year we joined the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, sorry, long name, and we provided an additional $4.1 million grant in addition to the federal funds from DOE and the generous matching from NYSERDA. So in all, Maryland is working comprehensively across the entire offshore wind industry to help support the industry and grow organically in the state, as well as larger national supply chain as well. That really concludes the remainder of my chat.
Thanks very much, Sam. This is Carrie. Can folks hear me? Michael, can you confirm that I'm back on?
Yep, you're back on.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. It cut out for a tiny bit. So thank you very much. And thanks to our four state presenters. Super helpful for me to hear from you and the details of what you're doing in supply chain. And I'm hoping that this conversation helps to connect those a little bit. It's certainly prompting my thought process, and I made a lot of notes about how we can help to connect all of those, as well as the entities that are on those supply chains and connecting them more together. But before we go, I just had a couple other things I wanted to mention this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located. First is Liz and I are thinking about this group and really, we wanted to do this morning to, as well as the research institutions, developers, and industry as a whole. And a couple things that I'm looking for to kind of get off this call and later this week, would love some direct responses back to me. My email address is here on some of these questions, which is, what would be helpful for you from a supply chain perspective? What could we be doing, the consortium and the network, to help connect both small, the connections I raised earlier in the conversation, small companies with larger companies, innovators with research institutions, in academia. What else would be useful? Would more targeted, the third bullet here should be targeted webinars, with something targeted on specific supply chain aspects. I'm thinking back to the wheel that Liz presented, which was quite useful, the colorful wheel showing the 4 different sectors. Would things of that nature, bringing together, research institutions and some of the innovators on each of those sectors, be helpful? Provide us some feedback. What would be useful to you from your perspective in terms of networking and supply chain in a very material way to help foster both development of course our offshore industries, but really way down the chain, research and innovation and investment of new ideas, technologies, second, finally, I mentioned earlier, the consortium has wrapped up its NYSERDA solicitation, PON 4124. We'll be making award announcements later this spring, but also we are in the process of designing a new solicitation for our additional funding that we have, that we hope to launch in July, which will look at our roadmap, which is on our website, and determine what areas might need some more focus, where do we think innovation can be most helpful to market development and to developers. So keep your eyes open for more news about that solicitation, which we expect, again, to come out in July. And we're hoping that this sort of conversation helps foster a conversation among all of you in thinking about responding to that solicitation and working together on it. If you have questions about what we spoke to about this morning, or want to be put in contact with anyone, again, please feel free to use my email address, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And with that, I think we're just a minute early, which is great. I think I'll wrap up for this morning. And thank you all so much for your help. For the folks that joined us and spoke this morning, it was a lot to get in an hour. And given all that's going on, appreciate your attention this morning and hope you found it all useful. Take care, everyone, and we'll speak again soon.